centers and to those who wish to remain at home.
We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Not only will this tax plan pay for itself, but it will pay down debt.
There are moral and legal obligation questions that I think we'll have to wrestle with as a society.
When we as people go wobbly on the truth, we go wobbly on America.
All you have to do is look at the numbers, look at what we've done.
And this is only the beginning.
From 100.9 FM WXIR, this is Evidence of Design, and I'm your host, Jason Taylor. Evidence of Design is a live talk show about the political economy. We critique income and wealth inequality and support democratic values. Thank you for listening, and welcome. Good morning, everyone. You are listening to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. Thank you for being here with us on Evidence of Design. My name is Jason Taylor, your host, and I'm joined by my good friend and co-host today, Matt Treadwell.
Hey.
We are on our 35th episode, and if you're new to Evidence of Design, we talk about income and wealth inequality on this radio show. Matt and I believe that income and wealth inequality does not get the proper attention that it deserves, and Matt and I believe that most of the political and social strife going on in the world nowadays is due to economic strife, ergo income and wealth inequality, which is caused by a number of factors, and Matt and I do our best as civilians who work jobs and have limited free time to do our best to do what we can to cover and raise awareness about it.
Families, children.
Besides that part.
We all have to take care of it.
we all have to do our part. But really, speaking of doing our part, we do appreciate you being here and participating and listening on WXIR, which is I believe, a strong and great asset for a community radio station to exist in Rochester. Thank you for being here. You can participate throughout the show. You can call in to us live. We are here live for you at 585-219-8889. I was about to give my cell phone number again, but that's 585.
At least it wasn't your social security number.
That's right. No, that doesn't roll off the tongue as easily, but 585-219-8889. We'll also take your emails throughout the show, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com. We do have an email account there for you, evidenceofdesign101@gmail.com.
Talk to us. Engage with us. What do you think? How do you feel?
That's what the show is all about on a community and, well, live.
How's your weekend going?
Yes, let us know that too. Happy Saturday. Happy Saturday. I, for one, this was a very long week, and I'm thankful to have a little bit of rest this week. But on today's show, folks, we are going to be talking about two events in the news this week that are related, I think, to income and wealth inequality. The first is the ongoing protests in France. It's called the Yellow Vest protests, or the Gilets jaunes in French. And the protests are going on right now in Paris. I believe they're 6 hours ahead or whatever with the time zone, but there are protesters right now all across France, particularly in Paris. A few people have died from the protests already. They've been going on for a few months, and we're going to talk about where those protests have come from and where they're going and how it relates to income and wealth inequality. So right now, as I'm speaking, in France, there are protests going on, and how are they related to income and wealth inequality, and why should we, as Americans and listeners, why should we care about them? Stay tuned. We'll also be talking in the show about some of the political developments in the state of Wisconsin following the 2018 midterm elections. The Republican-controlled legislature in Wisconsin has already passed some laws and legislation that is restricting the power of the incoming Democratic executive branch, particularly the governor, Tony Evers. And so we're talking about some of the legislation that the Republican legislatures have passed in Wisconsin and why that's significant, and again, how it's related to income and wealth inequality. Sounds fun?
I'm so excited.
I'm excited too. So thanks, listeners, for being here. We want your participation again. But until then, Matt, let's take it away.
Will of fortune, wealth of nations, chance of winning, with proof of purchase. Chances are better with documentation.
Matt, who was that?
Oh, I think you know, Jason.
I think we saw them this Monday, actually.
We did.
Buffalo.
We saw Proto Martyr, that's the band that plays that song, Wheel of Fortune, with Preoccupations and opener Rattle from Nottingham. It's a good show.
Yeah, in Buffalo, New York, we try to see a number of concerts as often as we can, but, time constraints, etc. But that was a good show, and I had a lot of fun. So check out Proto Martyr if you're interested in that. What is that? Post-punk?
Post-punk.
Industrial punk, post-punk. Yeah. That is good stuff. And it is apt for what we're talking about today as we jump into the protests going on in France on Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. As mentioned in the introduction, if you're just joining us, there are protests going on as I speak live here in France right now. They've been going on since November. The protests are called the Gilets jaunes, or the Yellow Vest protests, and they're called that way because those protesting are wearing high visibility yellow vests. It's actually French law for motorists to have in their cars those like yellow safety vests that construction workers often wear. And so I think, honestly, not agreeing or disagreeing with what they're protesting, I think it's a brilliant symbolic sort of movement, an asset that they're using, as most protests much do. You know, protests are often very performative, and that's how you capture attention. And so I think it's really, really symbolic for wearing these high visibility vests to say, look, like,
pay attention to us.
Pay attention to us. We're stuck on the side of the road as the average citizen. We need help.
Yeah.
You know, where's AAA? You know, I don't know if France is AAA, but you know what I mean? Like, we need help. And I think that's a really great symbol. Yes. Trois. And so today on Saturday, the French government has been bracing for what is seen as the largest and most dangerous round of the Gilets jaunes or Yellow Vest protests. There are 89,000 security forces currently deployed throughout France. In Paris, there's 8,000, and the French government notably has deployed 12 armored vehicles, which hasn't been done in decades. Wow. There are some serious student protests in the 60s, you know, as there were in the U.S. too. And I know France has a much more, I would argue, tumultuous political history in terms of different regimes and more, I think just the French...
The reign of terror.
Yes. Bonaparte and... I just realized that I'm going to have to pronounce so many French words that I...
You just realized. I think you've been studying for the past 6 hours.
This is going to be rough. No, I'm just messing. But so I think in French culture, they are generally more socially activist, and protesting is just more common in France. And so it's noteworthy, all the security forces deployed around France, and as mentioned, a number of people have already died in the protests throughout the past couple months. So the protests started, though. Where did they come from? They started in end of October and start of November, when the French government, led by a newly elected Emmanuel Macron...
Macron?
Yes. He instituted, or planned to institute, a fuel tax. And so the fuel tax would tax fuel, and it was ostensibly, the government said that they needed this new tax on fuel in order to pay for climate change. And so climate change is a big thing, and, you know, we have the Paris Climate Accord that Donald Trump notoriously pulled the U.S. out of. And so, you know, Paris was kind of symbolically leading the world fight against climate change, I guess you could argue. And the Macron government said that they're going to increase fuel taxes to help fight against climate change. But This did not go over well, particularly in rural areas. So the Gilets jaunes protests started in rural areas because those individuals are more reliant on cars for transportation. They don't live in big cities like Paris, which has more public transportation. And these individuals in rural areas who have already felt largely disaffected by Macron's government, or the governments of France for a while, have sort of blown up, and this has taken to the streets against the fuel tax. So the government has since rescinded their plan to institute a fuel tax that is no longer on the table, but it was seen as too little too late by the French people, it seems, and now the protests have spread, and it's no longer just about the fuel taxes, which again aren't even going into effect anymore. It is essentially what seems like protests against the entire French government, particularly Emmanuel Macron, who has been labeled the president of the rich for quite some time now. So enter in the arguments about income and wealth inequality, where if we remember in early 2017, when Donald Trump was just elected, the Brexit negotiations were in the works, so the UK had planned to leave the EU, and then Italy had elections with sort of right-wing populists as well. And then we had the French election in early 2017. The world eye was still very scared about this rising nationalism and far-right movements. And we had Emmanuel Macron versus Marine Le Pen,
leader of the National Front.
Right. And she was the Trumpian candidate in France. Many were shocked and surprised to see her at the top of the ticket. And she was all about anti-Islamization. She was about xenophobia, closing borders, make France great again.
Her father, which I believe is the the founder of the National Front Party, has made several anti-Semitic remarks in the past, I believe.
Yeah.
He has ties to neo-Nazis as well.
Yep. And
that's just where these people are coming from. It's scary to see that, somebody who has at least second-hand ties to neo-Nazism, if not, first-hand ties, is a serious political contender for the presidency of France.
Mm-hmm. It was a very shocking election in France because both Emmanuel Macron and Marine Le Pen, the National Front, both of those candidates were not in the main two French political parties. Mm-hmm. Emmanuel Macron actually started his own political party called En Marche, like France on the Move, and that's the party that's still in power, both in the parliament and the executive branch, essentially, of the French government. And so it was very surprising at the top of the tickets to see two non-major political parties. And again, this is a reoccurring theme throughout the world. And so Emmanuel Macron was elected. He beat Marine Le Pen 66-39 or some vote like that. So he had a sizable victory. But again, it must be taken into context that she was a far-right nationalist. And Emmanuel Macron, here's the point, Emmanuel Macron ran on a very pro-capitalist, pro-business platform. He is what I would call, and we've called on the show, a neoliberal, meaning he wants to use capitalism as the main vehicle through which our society is structured. So we need free and open markets. We need high competition. The government needs to stay out of the way of the economy, except when it needs to get involved to support the freedom of the economy. So neoliberalism isn't about making the government so small that it doesn't exist. Neoliberalism is about re-articulating the government, not to serve the needs of the people, but to serve the needs of business. That is the major point. And so that is what Emmanuel Macron has been doing. He's been restructuring French society. Now, again, France is historically seen as a very rigid society. They have strong unions and labor organizations, and that costs the government a lot of money. I'm not saying that's good or bad. But long story short is Emmanuel Macron has instituted a number of changes. Notably, he has repealed what's called the solidarity tax on wealth, which I think is a wonderful title, the solidarity tax on wealth.
Just rolls off the tongue.
Well, I really do think it's a wonderful title, though, because the idea is look, it's a solidarity tax, meaning we're all in this together. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great way to view taxation. But long story short is that tax has been in France since 1982, and it taxes individuals only on their assets if they're above around $1.5 million. So if
their total wealth or if the asset itself?
Only if they're assets. So it's not about your income. It's not about what you get through your labor. It's about your assets. So stocks and bonds and property and stuff like that. Stuff that most people don't have, or at least, enough to qualify. The vast majority of people do not qualify on this. It's for millionaires.
Right.
And so Macron repealed that, and a lot of people are angry about that and other things. And so Macron has been sort of nomenclated as the president of the rich. So much more can be said about this topic because it is continuing and developing and going on right now in France. Long story short is there are protests going on. They started from proposed fuel tax hikes from people in rural communities who are angry. Now it has spread. I just, before we started the show, I was just checking the news, and the protests have now spread to Belgium and the Netherlands.
Oh, wow.
And note, neither of those two countries had a fuel tax hike at all. So again, it's not about the fuel tax anymore.
Also not France.
They're also not France. They're not run by Macron.
Macron must go.
Yes, that's what people are calling. And so my argument is that why these protests are starting because of income and wealth inequality, and we're seeing again and again that the candidates who are at the top of the tickets are not representative of the needs of the people and the needs of our society. France was stuck with two bad options. Emmanuel Macron, a neoliberal capitalist, versus Marine Le Pen, a racist, xenophobic, right-wing candidate.
Why does that sound familiar?
Yes, why exactly? And that's the argument. We're seeing this all the time in the U.S., in Brazil, etc., etc., etc. So that's my argument. Let us hear the argument of our dear president, Donald J. Trump, who tweeted this morning. This is Trump's tweet from this morning. The Paris Agreement, i.e. the Paris Climate Accord, isn't working out so well for Paris. Protests and riots all over France. People do not want to pay large sums of money, much to third world countries that are questionably run, in order to maybe protect the environment. Chanting, "We want Trump. Love France." It is so hard to read a Trump tweet because it makes no comprehensible sense. But long story short, Trump is saying people in France are protesting because they don't like the Paris Climate Agreement, which, by the way, the U.S. and like two other nations are the only nations not in it. And he's also saying that there's protesters in France cheering, "We want Trump." I'm not saying that there aren't 5 people in the Paris protests who might be saying, "We want Trump." That is not the point of these protests. Donald Trump, again, is deflecting. He's lying.
Down with the president of the rich. We want Trump instead.
Yeah, it's not helpful. And so this is nonsense. And so long story short, listeners, pay attention to this. Again, these protests to me are symbolic of much larger problems in our global politics nowadays, where there are no candidates out there advocating for progressive reforms that we need as a society. We need governments to take bold action on wealth taxes, the kind that Macron repealed, on financial taxes, debt-free college, a Green New Deal, job guarantees, paid maternity leave, universal basic income, universal health care. We need politicians and candidates out there at the top of our tickets who are fighting for those things. Hopefully we will see that in 2020 in the U.S. Until then, I'm afraid that we're going to keep seeing a lot of angst and anxiety and anger out of people across the world as they're stuck between far-right nationalists and capitalists. And it's not good, and I'm not sure what the solution is besides to keep talking about it and to keep rephrasing the argument in economic inequality terms, because I believe that is what the vast majority of people want. They want or are angry about, and they want just food on the table and rights and responsibilities that they have as citizens to be taken care of by their government. Until then, we'll be stuck in some difficult places. Let's see how this develops, though. And so, listeners, thank you for listening and joining to us at Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. Remember, you can participate throughout the show. We'd love to hear from you at 585-219-8889. Again, 585-219-8889. Let's turn our lens back now domestically to take a look at the grand old state of Wisconsin. I don't know much about it besides they make cheese. Is that what that's about?
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So, all right, moving on from Wisconsin.
Where is Wisconsin on the map, Jason?
I think, is it not to the left of...
The left.
It is to the left of Michigan.
It depends on where you're standing.
Well, it is to the geographic west of Michigan, is it not?
Yeah, maybe.
Sure. No, so just kidding. Turning back now to domestics to Wisconsin. Matt, there are a number of notable developments coming out of Wisconsin since the 2018 midterm election. Help me figure out what is going on with these Republicans in Wisconsin.
Oh, if I must. So, interestingly, just this past week, conservative legislators in the State Assembly of Wisconsin have put through a number of bills to restrict the powers of the Democratic-elect Governor Tony Evers and the Democratic Attorney General-elect Josh Kaul. Until recently, Wisconsin had been governed by Republican Scott Walker, whom I'm sure we're all very much familiar with.
Maybe not, but he's a very, very conservative governor of
Yes.
Wisconsin. Sorry to interject, but yeah, he's been notably conservative for the past 8 years.
And he's mounted several presidential campaigns too, I believe, at
Yep.
least 2.
Mm-hmm.
So what are these new restrictions that conservatives are putting through? Among other things, they are making it illegal for Wisconsin to take itself out of a multi-state lawsuit against the ACA, which is something that Tony Evers, the Democratic-elect governor, actually campaigned on. Like, that was one of his explicit promises, was to pull Wisconsin out of that lawsuit. They're limiting early voting, and they are also ensuring safeguards to protect the Economic Development Agency, which we will talk about a little bit later. Interestingly, there are similar efforts that are being planned in Michigan right now, where voters have elected 3 Democratic women to top levels of office. I wasn't clear in the research, but this may in fact be like the first time
I think it is
in our history that we've elected 3 women to such top levels of office.
at least in Michigan, if not nationwide.
Yeah. And those are Gretchen Whitmer for governor, Dana Nessel for attorney general, and Jocelyn Benson for secretary of state of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it might be easy to assume that because of how blindsided everybody feels by these developments that this is a new thing, but it actually takes inspiration or root from a similar series of events that took place in North Carolina back in 2016, where Governor-elect Roy Cooper won office against the incumbent Pat McCrory, who was a Republican. So back in 2016, after Roy Cooper won the election, it was in, I believe, December 2015, I think. Yes. Where Republican state legislators passed a series of bills to limit the powers of Roy Cooper. They prevented, among other things, Cooper from appointing his own cabinet members without legislature approval, something that had never been done before. It reduced the size of Cooper's administration from 1,500 positions to 400. Previously, back in 2013, that number had been raised from 400 to 1,500 positions for Pat McCrory. And it also ensured that the state and county board of elections would be led by Republicans in election years instead of the governor's party, as it had traditionally been. Democrats would control the election board in off-election years, which, why do you need an election board during years that there's not an election? I don't understand how that makes any sort of sense. But, so Cooper has since challenged these changes in a number of lawsuits in court, and he's seen some success in reversing them. For just this past week, actually, Republican legislators in North Carolina submitted a proposal to return control of the Board of Elections to the governor's office, while also creating a separate ethics commission composed of both Democrats and Republicans, equal amounts each. Yeah, I don't know too much about the whole elections office. I think it's kind of weird that the governor's party would control it too, because it's like, wouldn't you want somebody outside of the political arena to be overseeing that?
Same with redistricting too and gerrymandering. Like, the idea is, wouldn't you want your political districts to be drawn by not politicians?
Right.
And I think there's some advocates out there, like you're saying, Matt, who are moving towards that. Let's have our elections, as we saw in Georgia, with Brian Kemp, I believe, versus Stacey Abrams. As we see these things develop and these really huge conflicts of interest, speaking of Donald Trump, but these conflicts of interests with political gerrymandering and the oversight of elections, I think we're starting to see more footwork in terms of pushing for these reforms to make them run by a third body. Unfortunately, what happens, I think, is that these things always come up in election years, and then they die away, and there's never enough concerted push to make them happen.
Yes. So while Cooper has seen some success in winning back the powers that are typically granted to somebody of his office, for example, I know that Republicans in North Carolina have lost their supermajority, which means that effectively Cooper will have his vetoing power back. There still remains a lot of work to be done. A lot of these lawsuits are still in the process, and it remains to be seen how successful he will be. But anyway, let's move back to Wisconsin, and let's talk about. We've talked about a number of things on the show that this relates to. We've talked about how conservatives use or introduce measures to prevent early voting, or voter registration ID laws, which are a thinly veiled attack, in my opinion, on the voting rights of minorities, people of less wealth, people that the Republican Party, instead of trying to extend like some level of policy and try to win them over, they just suppress them instead.
Mm-hmm. And Matt, if I may just provide a brief context about this. So everything that you're describing from North Carolina with the election of the governor of Roy Cooper, and also in Wisconsin that we're talking about, where Tony Evers defeated Scott Walker, these are efforts by essentially the losing party to restrict the power of the incoming party.
That's right.
And so what this means is that when an election happens, we know who's going to run. We know who won. So Tony Evers will become the governor of Wisconsin, but
Yes.
not until he assumes office next year. And so what this means is that, the Republican-controlled government can still make stuff happen. And it's important to note that it was a very close election in Wisconsin. Tony Evers was actually, I think it was a big surprise that he won.
Yes, it was I think it was something like 30,000 votes. He won by 30,000 votes.
Yeah, it was very close. Neither candidate got 50% of the vote. It was like 49 to 48 or something. And Tony Evers he was the superintendent of the schools of the state. He's an educator, and he won the governor's seat, which is a big surprise. And well, it might not be a surprise because Scott Walker had for 8 years warred against unions, warred against education, and the teaching staff. And I'm in education, so I know this with people I talk to in research. Scott Walker effectively waged war against education in Wisconsin, and in my mind, really damaged what it meant to be an educator there and to protect the teachers union and other unions. And so he's kind of, in my mind at least, Scott Walker's a very effective Bond villain, because he's this guy that you don't really know or see, but he's always in a suit and just doing really bad stuff. And so this was a surprise, and it was a surprise to Scott Walker. And everything you're saying, Matt, if you could quickly describe though, like what exactly is the Republican legislature doing and proposing to restrict the power of Tony Evers? Like what are they trying to do specifically with their legislation?
Well, I mean, I could pull some direct quotes from Wisconsin lawmakers.
Sure.
So we have Wisconsin Senate Majority Leader this week, Scott Fitzgerald. He said, "Listen, I'm concerned. I think that Governor-elect Evers is going to bring a liberal agenda to Wisconsin." You also have Wisconsin State Assembly Speaker Robin Vos, who's also Republican, saying, "Without these new bills, we are going to have a very liberal governor who is going to enact policies that are in direct contrast to what many of us believe in." I am concerned about the rising tide of liberalism, the ideology that supports healthcare for people and
for everyone,
and wants to take care of the population.
Liberalism is so bad. The fact that it cares about humanity and not money.
Why would they do such a thing?
Yeah, it's almost like people voted for liberals.
Well, that's the thing, is that it was a very close election. But it's not as if Tony Evers didn't win the popular vote. People clearly want him in power, and that's the whole idea behind the democratic process. And why I brought up early voting earlier is it's another example of the Republican Party. Like, instead of trying to alter their message, instead of trying to do some level of sensible, introspective thinking and reevaluating themselves, they just try to pervert the democratic process in order to suit their own needs and to remain in power as much as possible. And it's not, and I shouldn't say that Democrats don't do this before. Democrats gerrymander too.
Certainly.
But this is just a dangerous precedent to set, and it's going to end up in one of two ways. It's either going to end up hurting the Republican Party down the road when people remember this and think that they don't want any more of this, or it's going to lead to more aggressive attempts to undermine the democratic system, which is incredibly frightening.
Yeah, I mean, this rings such a loud bell for me from cue in my favorite cardboard cutout, Mitch McConnell, man. Like, this is the problem when you go low, everyone else goes lower, the race to the bottom, where, again, Merrick Garland, Mitch McConnell says the Senate will not hear anything that has to do with Merrick Garland, even though, in my opinion, it was their constitutional obligation to do so. Merrick Garland was Obama's Supreme Court nominee in 2015, right when Justice Antonin Scalia died. Mitch McConnell says, no, we're not going to hear him. You know why? Because the American people deserve to have their voice heard in the presidential election. Even though the American people made their voice heard in the election that elected Barack Obama, Mitch McConnell says, no, doesn't matter. Let's wait for the 2016 presidential election. He got really lucky that Donald Trump won. And now he is gleeful and smug with all this Supreme Court nominees. But this is the same argument, right? Just used against. So now the Republicans are saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. I know that the population of Wisconsin voted in a liberal governor.
I know that they voted wrong, but...
Right. They voted wrong, so we have to protect them from their agenda. No, the people of Wisconsin voted for the agenda that they want, and you don't want them to have it because it goes against your policies. And it was very close. So and this is the problem with our political system, right? Just because Tony Evers gets 0.5% more of a vote than Scott Walker, I don't believe that Tony Evers then has supreme authority over the state. Like, you have to compromise, and that's the point of compromise, or politics, is to compromise. And so I don't know where we stand with how you compromise then in a government, or with political parties that aren't that are seeking to destroy one another. And this is that quote from Hillary Clinton a few weeks ago that we covered on the show, where Clinton said, how do you negotiate with a Republican Party that wants to destroy everything you stand for? Right. And this is the fundamental question that we have to deal with now as a society, is like, where do we draw the line with the Republican Party? To what extent are they literally destroying what it means to be a human being in a civil society? And to what extent do we have to compromise with them, and should compromise, because that's the point of politics?
I agree. And we should move on to an example of
you don't have an answer?
Politics
yeah.
that, yes.
And first, yes. So listeners, maybe you can help us with an answer, though, if you're just tuning in to 100.9 FM WXIR. We're talking today about the Gilets jaunes protests in France, the Yellow Vest protests, and also some efforts by the Republican lame duck legislature in Wisconsin
lame duck
to hamstring the power of the incoming Democratic governor, Tony Evers, among others. And so thanks for being here and listening with us on Evidence of Design as we try to investigate income and wealth inequality and how it hurts us and harms us and how it manifests across the globe in politics. You can participate in our show, participate in our discussion. Don't be afraid. We don't bite, at least over air, at least over the radio waves. We can't. 585-219-8889. 585-219-8889. Matt, hold me back, strap me in. What are we doing about what else is going on in Wisconsin?
All right, let's talk about it.
Let's do it.
So we've talked a bit about, we've talked at length about on this show before healthcare. So a number of things that the Republicans have tried to restrict, as I said earlier, is the lawsuit that Wisconsin is currently a part of against the ACA. I know that they're trying to introduce work requirements for Medicaid users. And we've talked a bit about that in the show. But one of the things that I sort of honed in on and found interesting was these protections that they're putting in place for the Economic Development Agency. And so one of the really, I guess, interesting side notes of the story is a deal that the Walker administration made with a company called Foxconn back in, a deal that was sort of first outlaid in the summer of 2017 and signed in November of 2017. Jason, what do you know about Foxconn?
I don't know much at all. I've heard about this case with economic development. I've heard a lot about corruption and how it's not doing as much as it could, but I really don't know much.
So Foxconn, a.k.a. Wayland Yutani, a.k.a. Tyro Corporation.
LLC.
a.k.a. Engine. Is a Taiwanese-based company. The CEO is Terry Goh. It is the world's largest contract electronics manufacturer. They build a variety of noteworthy products that we all probably have used at some point in our lives, such as the iPad, iPhones, the Amazon Kindle, as well as gaming devices such as the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, Nintendo 3DS, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, Wii U, all those. In 2012, it was estimated that Foxconn was responsible for building 40% of consumer electronics sold worldwide. 40% of all consumer electronics sold in the world were built by Foxconn in 2012. That is enormous.
It's a lot.
It's a lot. So what is this deal? So basically, the Walker administration offered Foxconn $3 billion in subsidies to build a Generation 10.5 LCD manufacturing plant, a factory that would primarily manufacture glass panels which are used in the creation of 75-inch flat-screen TVs. When it first came out, it was championed by Scott Walker as this huge thing. Some people might remember that he originally ran for his first term. He made a promise that he would create 250,000 new jobs within his first term.
Yay, jobs.
Yeah. It didn't happen.
No, jobs.
2 years into his second term, it still hadn't happened. And so Scott Walker was looking for, some say that he was looking for a big win in this, in this area. So he offered a $3 billion subsidy for this $10 billion investment into this LCD manufacturing plant and the creation of 13,000 new jobs. It was later found out, first through investigative journalism and later through Foxconn's own admission, that instead of the $10 billion Generation 10.5 LCD manufacturing plant, they were going to build a much cheaper Generation 6 factory for about $2.5 billion. They did promise that they would honor the $10 billion investment. They just weren't going to make the 10.5 generation plant. And they also stated that originally the manufacturing jobs that they were intending to create for this factory would instead be run mostly by robots. I think I remember reading a Foxconn. Doesn't that sound familiar? I think I remember a Foxconn official saying something like, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, this is back earlier this year, if you'd asked me 6 months ago what the job makeup would be, I would have said 75% manufacturing jobs, 25% engineering, upper management jobs. Now it's like 10% manufacturing jobs, 90% management, and higher skilled work, which is not what a lot of people need, I guess, in Wisconsin right now. Like, one of the issues that a lot of people face is finding good paying work and labor for lesser skilled individuals. So obviously the people of Wisconsin were not happy about that. Interesting. Also, what's also interesting to notice is that where do I have it? Yes. Back in 2011, Walker's administration effectively cut the corporate income tax for manufacturers to zero.
Yay, no taxation.
Which meant that the subsidies to Foxconn would not be a tax write-off, but billions in cash that would be paid back by state income taxes paid by the people employed at this factory, which would roughly translate into every household in Wisconsin having to cough up an additional $1,774 to cover this tax subsidy.
Oh, God.
For a bunch of robots to work in a factory and ruin the environment. Because guess what? The creation of LCD screens involves a number of chemicals which if they are discharged improperly, can be incredibly hazardous. And while Foxconn officials have stated that they would exceed the necessary environmental regulatory requirements and invest in technologies and new high-tech methods to help them accomplish this, their company has a noted history of doing the exact opposite. A report by the City of Milwaukee's Legislative Reference Bureau found that as of 2013, 25 to 60 million acres of China's arable land were polluted with heavy metals due to electronics factories. Yeah. And Foxconn has been a significant contributor to this. It certainly hasn't helped that Walker's administration and Scott Pruitt, before his resignation, waived many of the state and federal environmental requirements for Foxconn. One of the reasons why Foxconn actually wanted to set up in Wisconsin is because the creation of these LCD screens require a great amount of water, an enormous amount. And Wisconsin is one of the states that happens to have a Great Lake in it. I don't know which Great Lake it is off the top of my head, but there you go.
Huron?
No.
We are the worst. We can't pronounce French words, and we don't know our geography.
Wisconsin's like a territory, right? Just kidding. Bring in the comedy. So all of this might sound bad enough, but so all this sounds bad enough, but Foxconn has like reneged on this deal. Foxconn has a history of reneging on deals like this with governments. Similar events have played out in India, Vietnam, Brazil, even Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And it's not clear if Foxconn got anything out of those deals, but I do know and can report that no matter how things go with this deal with Wisconsin, I can't talk, they will receive $1 billion in subsidies either way, even if nothing happens. And actually, one of the measures introduced in the bill, the bills that the lame duck legislature have passed, well, I don't know if they've been signed by Scott Walker yet, but they have passed through both the House and the Senate in Wisconsin. One of the measures is to completely eliminate the need for companies to even show that they are honoring these requirements.
Yeah.
And so
that was big in Amazon HQ too, real quick, Matt, is the idea were in the contracts between Long Island City and Queens and New York. The worry was that these contracts that were signed between state and city governments and the corporation, ergo Amazon or Foxconn, whomever, the worry is that you can enter these agreements and then if anything happens, the companies still end up on top because of the way the agreements are written to just give them money or subsidies or tax breaks or whatever. So like the taxpayers lose, the companies win. And this is the theme of politics for at least the past 40 or 50 years.
Right. So here we have Scott Walker making this gambit with Foxconn. It's not clear like how well he even researched the company's history because they have a noted track record of, like I said, reneging on deals that they make with governments. Foxconn signing onto this deal for what was originally $3 billion in subsidies. It's now climbed to $4.1 billion because of all the infrastructure that's needed to make this manufacturing plant even exist. You know, all the roads that need to be built to the location and such and such. And within months of it being signed, Foxconn has downgraded the facility. They've changed the entire makeup of the jobs that will be in the facility, and they've promised. I mean, the facility itself costs less to build than the subsidy that they're being paid.
Yeah. And
so this is like all this money. One journalist, I think, in an article that I read, noted that this is all money that could have been spent, you know, on infrastructure, on healthcare, on improving public education.
Yep.
But instead, it's being paid to this Taiwanese company to come in and
build robots,
and not create jobs, and jobs that people don't even probably want to work, jobs that probably won't even pay that well.
Yeah.
And this is the Republican business strategy. I just want to say, too, it's not really relevant in any way, but back in 2017 when this deal was first being negotiated, Scott Walker there was already a lot of criticism being directed at it, and Scott Walker famously said, you know, there are a lot of people out there trying to find reasons to hate this thing, and they can all go suck lemons. I just think that's pretty funny.
Thanks, Scott.
He's apparently very concerned about scurvy in Wisconsin. So,
dude, if you look up Scott Walker's political positions, he's like anti-abort. You know, so he's like, he doesn't want abortion rights.
Mm-hmm.
He wants to limit the ability of the government to restrict the purchases of firearms to people. He doesn't support universal health care. He doesn't support unions. He wants to restrict funding to education. He wants to lower taxes on wealthy individuals. Like, I don't know if I agree with Scott Walker on anything, man. Like, it's like, on any political position, it's actually phenomenal.
He's your antithesis.
Yeah, he's literally, like, whatever Scott Walker says, man, if he says suck lemons, like, I'm like, I like limes better, you know? Like, I don't know. Like, it's really bad. But yeah. So everything you're saying, though, Matt, so you gave sort of an in-depth example of the Foxconn, sort of business negotiation with the Wisconsin government and this outside corporation in an effort to create jobs. We've talked about whether or not creating jobs is a good or bad thing on the show before. Hence, we don't think that job creation is the best thing to put at the top of your list. Like, creating jobs doesn't mean anything. What are those jobs? What do they pay, et cetera?
I mean, I think it was recently reported that we're below 4% unemployment rate. So it's not as if people don't have jobs. It's that they can't live off the wages that they're being paid.
Matt, can we talk about this point right now? Okay, this is insanity to me. We have ostensibly the healthiest economy we've seen in decades. You've seen the New York Times report on this. You've seen Fox News. You've seen every single major media outlet report that we are living in a wonderful economy. Besides for the past few weeks, stocks have been at literally historic highs. We have the lowest unemployment in half a century. Matt, wages are stuck. Like, wages haven't risen forever, and people aren't making it by. So, we have all these, quote, healthy economic metrics in a working system. The idea is that wages would rise when all of these other indicators are there, right? The Fed's just raised interest rates, meaning the economy needs to slow down. Wages still aren't rising. Something is fundamentally broken within our economic system, and there's not enough attention being to be like, what's going on then? If this is the formula, right, economic production, if we have more economic output and GDP rises, wages should rise, meaning people are better off. People do not have enough money to live, even if they're working a full-time job. That is a problem.
Right.
And I don't know, creating jobs is not the answer. Bring in Foxconn, Amazon HQ2, it doesn't matter. You arbitrarily create jobs. That is not the answer. We do not need more jobs in this country, period. Sure, get more jobs, but make sure that the jobs are backed up by a social safety net and pay a living wage. And you can do that by taxing wealth and restricting the incomes and power and assets of wealthy CEOs and people in the top just 1%.
Yes.
Why does no one talk about that? It's weird.
We're talking about it.
Yeah, I guess we are. Yeah. So, folks, you're just tuning in to Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXAR. I have to reset. I have to emotionally reset. All right. We need some feng shui. We need some incense or tea or something.
We need to rearrange the room so that it's conducive towards our environment.
I'm a little charged right now, Matt, after that. No, I'm just kidding. So let's reset, folks. Thanks for tuning in on Evidence of Design on 100.9 FM WXIR. I really do appreciate you being here and listening to our show. You can participate to our show at 585-219-8889. Let's make it our show, as in you and I, not just Matt and I, but you as a listener and us. 585-219-8889. Please do participate. Matt and I, we were talking today about the Gilets Jaunes protest. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it even close to right.
You only had to say 4 French words a day, by the way. You're already messing it up.
I'm getting worse as time goes on. Let's do the English. We're talking about the yellow vest protests in France, which are going on as I speak, ostensibly about Macron's government to institute a tax on fuel, but it has really blown up. It has spread across the country, and now the protests are just against Macron, against the French government, because people are angry about what they see as a broken system that isn't looking out for their economic, educational, social safety net interests. So direct connection to income and wealth inequality there. We are seeing it all around the world because guess what? It just so happens that we are unlucky enough as liberals and progressives to get our candidates at the top of tickets, and therefore you're stuck with people like Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, a neoliberal versus a insert whatever word you want to use for Donald Trump that's not good for a politician. Donald Trump ticks it off.
I look forward to the day when Donald Trump becomes an adjective you can apply to candidates.
Yes, Trumpian. Yeah. A Trump. Yep, exactly. He will one day become a negative adjective. But so, we have that in the U.S. We see that in France last election with Macron versus Marine Le Pen. And we see it going on in some different iterations in Brexit. We just had a right-wing populist elected in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. Yeah. We see this in Italy. Yes. Germany, Angela Merkel is stepping down. There is a problem for Western democracy and what it means to live in liberal Western societies. We are losing what it means to care about, we're losing what it means to live in a liberal Western democracy. And then, Matt, you just talked about efforts by the Republican lame duck legislature in Wisconsin following the 2018 midterm election to restrict the powers of the incoming Democratic governor, Tony Evers, and the incoming Democratic legislative or executive branch. Sorry about that. And so you were speaking about some of the efforts that the Republican legislature have been trying to do, such as restricting the power of Tony Evers to not sue the ACA
Right.
to take Wisconsin out of lawsuits against the Affordable Care Act. Republicans want to continue to sue the ACA, even though, again, the ACA is almost effectively dead since the Republicans in their various tax bills and other bills have removed the mandate that you'd have to get health insurance.
Yes.
So the ACA is seriously hamstrung as it stands, but they still want to pursue legislative causes against it because guess what? Republicans do not care about your health care rights, period. Also, the Republican legislature has tried to make it so that the Tony Evers and the Wisconsin government couldn't investigate Wisconsin's Economic Development Corporation, which are pursuing bad deals like Foxconn, and among other things. And guess what? That's happening in New York State too. You want to say you can fairly criticize our show that we're hard on conservatives and the right. And I think we need to be because that's fair, and that's the argument that needs to be made in society today. But Democrats are worthy of criticism, too. We have this in New York State with Andrew Cuomo, who I would argue isn't the most liberal guy out there.
Zon Cuomo.
Zon Cuomo, who's changing his name now because we have HQ2 coming. But no, just kidding. But Andrew Cuomo, we have a lot of controversy around the Buffalo Billion. That's a part of New York State's economic development. And that was with Joe Prococo, his aide, who's, I think, been indicted and is going to serve time now. That's Andrew Cuomo's aide, Joe Prococo. And there's also Elaine Calleros.
Yeah, he's not indicted. I believe he's convicted.
Yeah, convicted, sorry. And then there's also Elaine Calleros, who's leading some polytechnic and sort of optics things upstate. And he has been, I don't know what the proper word is, too. I don't want to lead anyone wrong, but he's been sort of charged with doing bad things with economic development, too. So this is a thing that is a problem in our governments, to go after sort of bad deals, etc. Folks, that is what we covered today. That was a lot, but I hope we can kind of connect the dots. And I want to end on as positive a note as I can and think about where we go from here. And I think the argument needs to be this. Things aren't working all that well in our society for a number of reasons. And I think that reason, the main reason, is because that there are a lot of forces out there who don't really care about equality, whether it be racial, whether it be gender, whether it be ethnic, and particularly economic. We have, for a long time as a society, been run by increasingly pro-capitalist agendas. Increasingly, both in politicians, business circles, and also just you and I, as so-called everyday average citizens, have been increasingly subject to the idea that capitalism is the best way to run society, free market capitalism, and that we need more jobs, more jobs, more jobs. We need to work harder and harder and harder.
Well, that's a placebo. That's just to placate people.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is, it's not even that like capitalism itself is that bad an idea. It's just that capitalism without any sort of regulation or leash, anything to leash it back, and to make it so that it doesn't just eat itself. I mean, capitalism left to its own devices will, instead of like the argument is that if we have competition, that'll encourage people to make a better product. But at a certain point, it becomes less about making a better product or offering a great service, and more about just finding ways to milk as much money out of the system as possible. Yeah.
And you hit the nail on the head more succinctly than I could, Matt. It's all about just making money and not about the product or the quality or the other effects that it has. So I think we need to re-examine our relationships towards money, towards capitalism, and to ourselves as citizens and what it means to live, again, in a so-called liberal Western democracy. There is a wonderful political speech by John F. Kennedy. I'm not glorifying John F. Kennedy here. I just think that this is a really good speech. He made it on June 10th, 1963, a few months before he was assassinated at American University. So you could Google this. It's JFK's American University Commencement Address. I just want to read very brief excerpts. Long story short is that JFK makes the argument that we need to re-examine our relationships to certain things. Remember, in the context, the U.S. was in the midst of the Cold War. People were literally fearful about annihilation, like in global annihilation of death. We don't really have that fear anymore, but it's still there. And I think we take that for granted, Matt, people the age of you and I. We never grew up in a world fearful of nuclear holocaust. It's still there, though. Let's go back in time, though, to JFK's time, where we were literally fearful about nuclear holocausts. And JFK says this: "Some say that it is useless to speak of world peace or world law or world disarmament, and that it will be useless until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude." He goes on to say, "Let us re-examine our attitude toward peace itself. Too many of us think it is impossible. Too many think it is unreal. But it is a dangerous, defeatist belief. It leads to the conclusion that war is inevitable, that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces that we cannot control. We need not accept that view. Our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. So JFK says there, look, we need to think about world peace. We need to rethink our relationship with the Soviet Union. Whether or not they rethink it, we ourselves at least need to do that as Americans. And he says, let us re-examine our attitudes towards peace. Let us at least think that it's possible. Let us believe in the opportunity that humans can create. JFK goes on to say, second, let us re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union. It is discouraging to think that their leaders may actually believe what their propagandists write. So he's giving the Soviet Union there a little bit of legroom and leeway, saying, look, it's not enough to be angry at Russians. There's a difference between propaganda and governments. And as humans, I think that humans don't want nuclear holocausts because that's bad for everybody. And so he's saying, let us re-examine our attitude toward the Soviet Union. And lastly, briefly, JFK writes and says, third, let us re-examine our attitude toward the Cold War, remembering that we are not engaged in a debate seeking to pile up debating points. And so you can read the speech in full. Again, that's JFK's American University commencement address on June 10th, 1963. But I find that full speech really, really powerful and heartwarming for myself because it doesn't place the blame and onus on others, although I think it's right to do that at times. But I do think mostly like we need to just re-examine our attitudes towards certain things. All of us need to do that or else we're kind of going to be stuck in certain places. And so to end, I sort of hope, Matt, that, if I have to re-examine my attitude toward anything, it means I need to re-examine my attitude towards towards members of the Republican Party who aren't their actual leaders. I really have a hard time giving people like Mitch McConnell or Donald Trump any leeway at all because I don't think they're helpful at all in any capacity to our country. In fact, I think that they're destroying our country, Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump, etc. But as JFK writes about the Soviet Union, it's not fair for me to think that way of any conservative Republican. And I don't. But sometimes, you can get caught up in that. And I just hope that I can re-examine my attitude towards other people who might differ in beliefs than I do, only because, it's not because they're just sort of zombie hypnotized by Mitch McConnell, Donald Trump. But they actually, for some reason, find some value in conservatism. I need to figure out what that is. How about you, Matt? Do you have anything you want to re-examine your attitudes towards?
Nope.
You're all good. You're not a self-reflective individual.
No, that was very nice, Jason. I think it is very heartwarming to think that there's something that we can do to better understand why certain people do what they do, why Republicans want to take away voting rights and healthcare and the like. But I think that this message, at least in my opinion, would be better directed towards the Republican state legislators in Wisconsin right now. They need to be doing some soul searching about what they're doing. They're the ones who need to hear it more, I think, than you or I, honestly.
I agree. And so maybe we'll see how these protests in Paris develop. We'll see how the split government in Wisconsin plays out, and many, many more things in the news to come in the surrounding weeks of what might be deemed as political turmoil or angst. And we're definitely living through an interesting time, and I do think our way out of it is to re-examine our relationships towards the economy, towards money, and towards people who think differently than us in terms of the economic lens. And I would just hope that we start to think about income and wealth inequality in those terms, and more people adopt a social justice stance based upon income and wealth or economic justice, because there's a lot to be had there. And I think that a lot of this angst is coming out of people who just want to make money for the sake of making money and don't really care what effects it has on the vast majority of humans, on all 7.5 billion of us. So I do agree with you, though, that Matt, maybe this audience, average listener, this is